Hey there! In this video I am going to cover how to use granular synthesis to create the fundamental building blocks of most ambient music. Drones, which I'm going to define as a tone that gets sustained for a long time and doesn't have much or any variation, especially in pitch. Pads, which in this context I'm going to define as long sustained notes or chords that do vary over time. Textures, which I'm just going to sort of wave my hands here and define as interesting sounds that don't really fit into any other category. And then finally, soundscapes, which I'm going to define as some combination of the previous things that has some sort of evolution to it that makes it feel as if it were the sonic equivalent of a landscape with definable geographical features and maybe mountains and valleys and all sorts of things we could metaphorically describe like that. Now, I'm going to be using the Texture Lab for demonstration purposes, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about is generally applicable to any granular synthesizer you're working with, hardware or software. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. I've got a bunch of samples already loaded on my Texture Lab, and the one I'm going to start with here is this. So I created this sample a really long time ago, and if I remember correctly, it's my violin with a pickup mic on it, and then sent through an effects pedal, and then into an amplifier, which I was actually directly recording with a microphone in front of the amplifier. So a bit of an unusual source here, but the reason why I'm starting with this sample is that it's about as far away from a drone as we can get. And let me just play this sample out in full. I'm going to press the hold button on the Texture Lab and just let this note sustain. Okay, so the sample just automatically repeats itself once it gets to the end, and besides some unfortunate buzzing that you can hear from the amplifier, which we could probably get rid of with some filter. In fact, let me do that now. Yeah, that's better. So besides that, there's a few things going on in the sample that makes it really contrary to what we want with a drone. So instead of a single tone that's consistent from beginning to end, we have this really noticeable sharp attack at the beginning, this kind of rapid crest or buildup in the sound, and then it really rapidly decays, and then we have kind of a long sustain and release, then we have a bit of silence, and if you listen to the very end of the sample, you can hear me set down my violin. Yeah, you can hear it, and then the sound is reverberating because the vibrations are being amplified. So yeah, even though it's a simple note and it's pretty short, all taking place within 6 seconds, we do have kind of this sonic journey from beginning to end with quite a bit of variation, at least compared to what we want with a drone. We've got at least 6 different discernible sections here. We've got the attack, decay, sustain, release, silence, accidental noise at the end, and we don't want that. We don't want a journey of 6 parts. We want just one thing the whole time with a drone. So the most obvious thing to do here is to take our sample and make it short so that we only have one of those sections inside of it. So let's start by doing that. I'm going to take the length parameter of the sample playback and let's hold down a note, shorten the length, okay, we're still not quite at drone territory, but we're getting closer to there at least because we have a single sound now. But the problem is it's just being repeated over and over again. So let's keep going with this. Shorter and shorter and shorter, and at some point we just reach a basic sound wave. And at that point, well, we are in drone territory. I mean, I could just hold this note, but it's kind of horrible to listen to, and we're losing all of the character of the original sound by just reducing it to a sound wave. However, that's because we are on the dry side of the sample right now. If we go to the wet side and introduce some granular into this, and go all the way over to fully the granular side, well, now we're getting some of the sound back, but we're still having that problem of the kind of rapid fire of the sample. So let's keep going with this. I'm going to hold this note. It's going to be a little bit annoying sounding at first, so I apologize for that. And let's just open the length here a little bit. Okay, do you hear how we're getting closer and closer to a drone? So we don't want the sample window to be super, super small. But if we keep it fairly small, we're getting into drone territory. And At the moment, let me turn this off, we have our position at the very beginning of the sample, but we can shift that if we want while maintaining our length at the same very short window. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking the entire sample, keeping a very small window inside of it of what parts of the sound we're drawing from as we granularize it, and now we can start shifting that window back and forth through the sample like this. And do you hear that? Do you notice how, as I go away from the beginning, we start getting a smoother sound? And if you think about it, that makes sense, because at the very beginning of the sample, we have this really sharp attack, followed by a very sharp decay. Whereas in the rest of the sample, we have a fairly long sustain and release. So as we get into that portion of the sample, the sound becomes more consistent. And so if we're drawing from that portion of the sample, well, we're going to get a more consistent and smooth sound like this. Of course, we're also getting a kind of quieter, or you could say weaker sound, since we're drawing from a portion of the sample where we've already had some decay, and we're now in the sustain portion where the volume is much lower than the attack, which might have crested up here. I should really just figure out how to do graphics for these videos instead of using my hands. Anyway, so that's a basic way of starting to get into drone territory. There's a few other things we can do too. Come back to them in a bit. But just to stick here for a moment, another thing that we can do to build on what we've already done is we can take our drone here and we can increase the density parameter, and that really starts to smear things together. In reality, what we're doing here on the Texture Lab is as we go past the midpoint, we start to detune the grains rather than actually adding more grains and thereby increasing the density. But at the end of the day, what matters here is that we get kind of a thicker sound. And then another obvious thing that we can do is, of course, we can pump up the reverb. And I'm going to turn this shimmer off, and let's hold this now. Make it even higher. Bring it back down just to hear the difference. So yeah, you take the same sound and you start making it reverberate, which is what reverb is, and you start getting a lot of like overlap with that sound, which helps to smooth things out even further. All right, so now we have a bit of a drone going on here. And then if we want just a pure drone, well, we can just leave it at that point because we have no real variation going on with this tone, and a sort of prototypical drone doesn't have any variation, but in practice a lot of drones do have a bit of variation. And I think about this as being on two extremes. On the one hand, we could have really rapid fire modulation of our tone. So for example, let me hold this and let's try the size here. So these are the sizes of the grains. Just go back and forth between small and big. And we could automate those modulations as well. And so we could have really rapid fire modulations, or we could make them super slow and steady. Like that, so that we have at least some variation over time, which makes it a bit more interesting. And obviously this isn't the most interesting thing to listen to by itself. I mean, if I just hold this note and walk away, well, people are going to be falling asleep pretty quickly, but imagine that we had some sort of melodic element on top of this. Or some chords. Now we're getting into actual music territory. So yeah, just keep that in mind with drones. They're not like an end unto themselves. They're usually going to be serving a sort of foundational or backdrop function within a piece of music. All right, so that's one way of approaching drones with granular synthesis, but some other ways we could approach it too. So let me show you that next. I'm going to just reset everything here, go back to our sample. And okay, I'm going to go fully over to the granular side. Turn off the shimmer, still have some reverb on. Let's put a little bit of high pass filter on this to get rid of that kind of deep down buzzing from the amplifier. And now what I'm going to do is this. So remember what we did before. We have the overall sample, and then we're just like picking a really small window inside of that sample and then going granular on that bit. Another thing that we can do though is this. So the way I think about it is what makes a drone is that with any sound we have a beginning and an end. But with a drone, the end matches up with the beginning to such an extent that if you play two versions of it back to back, or in other words, if you repeat the sound, you get a seamless blend between them. And so what we did before was one way of doing that, making our window of sound really short and then sort of granularly blending stuff together to kind of diffuse it and make everything kind of merge together. But another way we can achieve the same effect is if we kind of destabilize the sense of there being a beginning and end to the sound in the first place. And the way we can do that is by randomizing the playback position. So I'm going to do that with these knobs and parameters here. This one controls the depth of the randomization, and this one controls the rate. I'm just going to start with them in more or less the middle positions. And so what this is going to do now is it's going to take our whole sample, and instead of playing through it in a linear way, it's going to randomly jump around. And the end result of that is going to sound like this, which we can then play around with. And okay, it's kind of like ping-ponging all over the place and doesn't quite sound like a drone, although we could turn that into some sort of interesting texture. And at the moment, the problem is that problem that we talked about earlier, where we have this really sharp attack, we have the silence, and they're all getting mixed together. And so as the playback jumps around, sometimes it's getting that attack portion, sometimes it's getting the silence, and it's all getting mixed together into a mishmash. And so what we can do here is, once again, we can shorten the window a bit, perhaps taking out that attack portion or taking out the silence. But this time we're not going to make it super short. We're just going to like chop off a little bit of the extreme aspects of it. So let's try doing that. The way I'm going to do this is, so we have two options when it comes to playback with the Texture Lab. We have that position and length knob and parameters that I showed you earlier. Position determining where we start and length determining how long we go from that starting position. But we can also shorten the sample itself. And the implication of that is that if we are randomly bouncing around, well, if we have our full sample, then it's going to be bouncing around the full sample. Whereas if we have a shorter version of that sample, then it's going to be bouncing around in this shorter section. So I'm going to change the starting position. We have values going from 0 to 9,999 on the Texture Lab. And I am going to increase the starting position by going function, start. This will increment in thousands. Can also go shift and change the value knob by hundreds, or lift off the shift button and it'll go to just units. Let's try, I don't know, 1,232. That sounds like the magic number. Let's try that. And there you go. I think now we're much more in drone territory just by doing that simple change. Another thing we can do along similar lines is, in addition to randomizing the playback position, we can also randomize the direction of the playback. So right now we're just playing everything forward from whatever random position we happen to be in, but we have a bunch of other options too, including just randomize everything. So what this means is we're going to be randomly jumping around in that shortened sample window that we have, and sometimes we're going to be playing stuff forwards, sometimes backwards, and the end result of that is we're going to get a whole lot of like complicated overlap between different portions of the sound being played in different ways, and that's going to sound like this. Let me actually change the filter here a little bit. And yeah, in this case we're actually getting closer to just like texture territory, but I actually kind of like how that sounds. It's kind of an organic quality to it. And we might want to play around with changing our starting position. Let's go back to the beginning so we get that sharper attack. And then let's lop off the end this time so that we get rid of that silence and the noise at the end. And let's maybe make the jump around a little less extreme by decreasing the rate. Playing around with the depth here. And let's try increasing the density and the reverb. Yeah, so a lot of variation this way with the drone, if we even want to call it that. And instead of any sort of like smooth modulation, we're getting a lot of randomness, which could be something you want in a sound. So that's another option that you have. All right, so that was with that sample, but there was nothing actually special about that sample. We can apply the same principles to just about any note like that. For example, here I have a piano note. Turn the reverb and the shimmer and the granular off on that. So here's the note. Very boring piano sample. And once again, we have the same problem here if we want a drone. We have a pretty sharp attack, then some decay and sustain and release, and then I think actually like half of the sample is just silence. And so if I'm holding it, well, really what we're going to get here is just a looped note, and that's not what we want. But once again, all we have to do is shorten the sample, go to the granular side, hold that down. And yeah, you get the idea. So applicable to other sounds as well. Let's take another one here. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I think it really helps to see multiple examples of things in action to really pick up on the more general ideas. So this is a violin sample. And so with this sound, we're already much closer to a drone because we have this really long sustain. And really, if we just zone in on that sustain, so this time I'm going to do it with the sample window. I'm going to make it sort of like in the middle. Let's try that. No, shorter. So right now we're on the dry side of the sample, and if we go to the granular side, let's try turning up the density here. And jumping around with the position just a little bit. And yeah, there we go. We are droning. All right, so those were all samples that just consisted of a single sampled note, but we could also have melodic samples that we could turn into drones. So let's take a look at that next. Oh, here's one I like. So this is a synthesizer sample from my OP1. So here we have an actual like melodic motif, and so definitely a lot of pitch variation, and so once again really far away from a drone where by definition we can't have pitch variation. But once again, same principles apply. We can just make our sample window much smaller. Let's go from 2000 to, I don't know, let's try 3100. Hold that. Okay, now we've just sort of isolated a single note of that, and now we can just sort of like blend it together by jumping around with the position and the randomness of that. Going over to the granular side, holding, finding the sweet spot, maybe increasing the density, increasing the reverb, and there you go. And a nice thing that we can do with this sort of sample is, let me go back to the original sample here, undo all of that. Another thing that we can do is we don't even really have to shorten the sample necessarily. If we get our randomization of our position just right with the depth and the rate parameters and go back over to the granular side. Oh, there we go. I mean, that's sort of like in between a texture and a drone, I would say. Although there's a lot of like gray area between these terms. But to me, I mean, that's a pretty interesting sound. Bring in some shimmer, play around with the density, play around with the playback direction. Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff is possible there. Alternatively, another thing we can do is let's go back to having our playback position not randomized at all. So we're back to, yeah, do have some reverb and shimmer on it, but that's okay. Another thing we can do here is make the sample super short by playing with the position and length parameters instead of shortening the sample window. Let's start at the beginning here. So this is going to sound like this. Really annoying on the dry side, but if we go to the granular side, everything gets blended together into a drone. And the nice thing about this method is that if we hold this, we can change the position parameter slowly and scan through our sample. And here, really, I mean, we're starting to get into pad territory, or even soundscape territory. And that could be an end unto itself. I mean, this could serve as a foundation for a song. You could easily hear that. But we can also use this method just to like scan through the sample and find a nice tone for a drone. So really versatile. All right, now while we're here and already starting to get into pad territory, let's just jump straight into pads now. So here is our current sound. Let's turn the shimmer off on this for the moment. Okay, I don't know about you, but to me, this already sounds like a pad. And let's just make sure that we can actually play this with chords. So I'm going to hold a C triad here. And no, we cannot, which is an important thing to bring up here, which is that when we are using this method to make a drone, we're really blending together a few different pitches, a few different intervals from whatever scale we're in, and that can really wreak havoc if we try to play something as a pad using chords. We're basically just mashing together a bunch of different musical keys by doing this, which can actually sound kind of interesting, but is probably not what we're aiming for. Okay, so let's go back to just making our sample window really small. It's easier to hear what's going on if we go to the dry side. So let's hold this. And oh, actually that was because I still have those position and length parameters set to a really small little patch. Okay, now let's try holding this. Make it smaller. Turn up the granular. Turn up the density. Randomize the position a bit here. Okay, let's try this. Let's see if we can actually play a C triad now. Too high, let's go down. Yep, that works. Okay, so yeah, something to keep in mind with this. You really don't want to be blending together different pitches if you're taking a drone and turning it into a pad. All right, now to really turn this into a pad, the next thing we're going to need to do is really increase our attack and release. In fact, I'm going to turn them all the way up to the maximum values. And this way, when I play one of the keys, the sound is going to really gradually come into play. And if I release it, it's going to slowly fade away. And this can be really great for ambient because what it means is I can, for example, start on this note here, hold that guy down, turn the volume down a little bit on this, bring in the next note of my chord, and the next note, and the next note. And then, if I want to shift to a different chord and have a chord progression, I can undo the hold by pressing clear hold, let it fade away a little bit, and then bring in my next chord. And as a chord is playing, we can also undo one of the notes, bring in a different note, and sort of gradually melt into another chord that way as well. Or, since the Texture Lab only has 4-note polyphony, we have 4 notes playing already, like this, and I press down another one, well, one of those notes is going to automatically disappear to make room for the new note. So that's another way of transitioning between chords. All right, now to me, the main difference between drones and pads is that with pads, we can have gradual evolution or development of the sound in all sorts of ways, such as pitch, which is what's happening when we have chord changes, but we can also gradually change any of the parameters that are going into our sound. And the key word here is really gradual. With ambient music and with pads, we want really slow, gradual changes. And my instinct, at least my impulse, is to go way too fast. I have to really slow down, and that's actually part of why I like making this music as opposed to some of the other music I make. I actually come from like more of a rock guitar background. This stuff really makes you slow down and get into almost a meditative state. Anyway, let me just show you a few things that I like to do here with these gradual movements. So something I've gone over in a whole bunch of other videos is turning our speed down on the playback to -47. And what that does is over on the dry side of our sample, that's going to pitch everything down an octave because of how slowed down the sound is getting. You can hear it because we don't have that granular blending effect. It sounds almost like static, kind of garbled sound, which can be an interesting texture. And over on the granular side, we're still an octave up from that. So if we start on the fully granular side and let our chord come into the picture, we can use this blend to gradually bring in that other octave and that garbled quality. Similarly, we can also bring in the shimmer gradually. Just going to bring a whole nother octave up. Actually, I think 2 octaves up. The same sound. So you can play around with those 2 parameters and get some interesting effects that way. Another thing that I really like to do is I like to take any one of these parameters, especially density and size, and bring it down into what I think of as like the danger zone, where our sound is starting to break apart, and then right as we get there, I let it linger and then bring it away a bit. Similar thing with size. Let's do that next. As we get really down low, we start to get into static territory. Maybe a bit too far, but then we can back away. And yeah, combining these things together can make for some really interesting effects. And then I've just been sustaining a single chord here the whole time just for illustrative purposes, and also because I can't like do too many things and talk at once. But you could be doing all of this stuff simultaneously with chord changes, and then things are going to get really interesting, at least as interesting as ambient music can get. And yeah, that wasn't a very smooth or gradual transition there. It takes a lot of skill, which I don't necessarily have to do it right. And also just patience. Like, I get too impatient with this stuff, and I make changes too quickly. Like, I really should let this hold for a bit. Then let it disappear for a bit, then bring in my next chord. Nice and slow, much slower than I'm used to going. I mean, when I'm playing guitar, I'm playing like a mile a minute. Here, it feels like glacial in comparison. Then, if we want to get into soundscape territory, we can start messing around with our position and where we are at in the sample. And here I'm expanding the sample size window, closing it. bring up the beginning of the sample size window. Kind of scooch over gradually. Again, I could be doing this all much more slowly. I also just kind of get nervous that people are going to like stop watching if I let these things develop for too long. But then, I don't know, I guess it's like, if you really want to make ambient music, you have to get used to going slow. Yeah, I mean, I think at this point we're already in like soundscape territory. We're mixing together kind of drones and textures, and there's a whole like mixture of stuff going on. And again, not necessarily an end unto itself, like I wouldn't record this and release it as a piece of music. But, you know, imagine like little rhythmic or melodic elements or loops or other textures coming in and out, and you could really start to develop a song with a foundation like this. And the nice thing about music is that that foundation can shift over time. It can start here and then, I don't know, move over here. And imagine I'm doing this all nice and slow and gradually and not worrying about people dropping off of watching the video. And yeah, you can really start to build something up here from this foundation. Again, just a foundation, not an end unto itself. But also maybe not super interesting to listen to, but it is super interesting to actually generate and listen to yourself. I can spend hours just doing this, though I wouldn't subject anyone else to listening to it. All right, so we're already starting to get into texture territory here. And if we want to go further, let's actually just keep going with the same sample. So I'm going to hold this. And if we want to turn this into more of a texture, I mean, we're already having a lot of texture going on here, but some things we can do are turn down the density and turn down the timing of our grains. So how often, how much they're getting released, how often they're getting played. And then we can also play around with our grain size, make it something fairly low. We can play around with the shape here too. And yeah, there we go. I mean, that's a texture. Another thing that we can do here is we can change over to arpeggio mode and arpeggiate the chord. Let's try this fresh from another sample. Undo everything. And okay, that's not the right genre. This is nice. Okay, so this is a ukulele sample that I've featured in some of my other videos. And let's do the same thing that we did before. So we're back at square one here. I'm going to turn the blend all the way up so they're fully on the granular side. Let's turn our density down. Turn our size down. And now let's mess around with the timing. Okay, now let's mess around with the randomization of the position. And yeah, there we go. Some sort of texture. Again, definitely not an end unto itself here. This would just be some sort of like background element, possibly, or a sound that just comes in for a brief period and then disappears from a song. Try randomizing the playback direction. Keep forgetting that word. Direction, direction, direction. Ooh, that's nice. Let's try turning that into a chord. That's very chaotic. But sometimes a little chaos is what we want. Let's try turning down the sample window. Randomizing the position some more. decreasing the speed or increasing it doesn't really have any effect on the granular side, just because of like how rapidly we're bouncing around. But on the dry side, it is having an effect, and so we can blend those two things together. Turn the shimmer off here for a moment. Also, you don't always need to put reverb on things. I think that's something I'm guilty of. Let's turn it off for a moment. Yeah, I mean, I kind of like that actually more without any reverb. Ooh, that's nice. Decrease the size and timing some more. Let's mess around with the shape here. Ooh, that's kind of nice. Let's try playing this as a chord down here. Let's try going into arpeggio mode, actually. Okay. It's kind of interesting. Again, would I listen to 4 minutes of this? No. But would it be cool as like a little effect going on in the background, or something that comes in for like 20 seconds or 10 seconds or 5 seconds? Yeah. Or could even do some chord progressions with this. And I don't know. By the way, I should have mentioned before that we can actually use arpeggiation for pads and for soundscapes as well. In fact, let us, just as kind of like a little challenge here, let's take that same sample. Let me reset everything. Okay, just as kind of a recap, let's turn this into a pad. So I am going to make the sample window very small. Granularize it. Randomize the position. Increase the density. Randomize the playback direction. Got the word that time. Increase the reverb a bit. And increase the attack and release as well. Okay, now let's switch over to arpeggio mode and arpeggiate a chord. And believe it or not, that is arpeggiating. I can prove that if I decrease the release and also the attack. It's just that they're all blending together into a single sound. But because we have that arpeggiation going on underneath, it's a bit more like wavery than it was before. Oh, which reminds me of another thing I like to do with these pads especially, which is that we can modulate the pitch of our sound. And if we take the depth and go super, super low, I mean all the way down to 1 or 2 maximum, even 3 is too high. Let's try 1 for starters. And then let's put the rate about at the middle. Play this. You get even more wavering. It's almost like a tape effect. You can, yeah, it gets a little too strong at 3. Super strong if we go up here. But yeah, if we keep it low and subtle, it's a nice little kind of nostalgic sounding effect. Keep in mind that we have different shapes for our modulation too. Random can be nice on this. It's kind of crazy to think that this is originally just a ukulele. All right, so my throat is starting to get sore here. I've been sick the last few weeks, had COVID at one point. I would really love to hear if anyone has any suggestions or ideas for how to do this stuff in the comments. I'm just sharing what I've learned on my own. None of this is meant to be like me presenting the definitive wisdom on any of this stuff. It's just me sharing my findings and thoughts. I'd love to learn from others. Also, let me know if there's anything you'd like me to cover in the future. If there's much interest in this topic, I'm thinking about doing a video where I show how to take these kinds of sounds and then actually put them together into first a soundscape and then an actual like ambient piece of music using a device like the SmplTrek, just for demonstration purposes as an example of a tool you can use for arranging music. So do let me know if you'd be interested in that as well. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, nice ones. Don't be mean. I'd love to hear from you. And if there's one takeaway lesson I could suggest taking away from this, it is to really remind yourself, and I'm going to remind myself of this as well, to take things slow. I was playing those chords way too fast at the end. Felt really slow to me because once again, when I'm on the guitar, I'm going like this with my fingers. I mean, I'm going crazy. I do a lot of like finger picking stuff. So it's really counterintuitive to me to go this slow, but it really pays off with the actual music you produce if you're able to do that. And be patient. Just be patient. Like, this is an exercise in learning patience and letting things sort of like just gradually grow and bloom into unexpected directions. And to me, that is the funnest part about this, is that you know, as you're turning these knobs, for example, you don't really know necessarily what you're going to get. Like, you can know the general principles and have a general idea of what's going to happen if you decrease or increase the density. Like, you know the sound is going to thicken up if you go all the way up on the density, and you know it's going to start to like break apart and fragment if you go down. Same thing with the size, but you don't know exactly what it's going to sound like at the end. So yeah, this is all about exploration and discovery. And so yeah, I'd really encourage you to embrace it with both of those mentalities, or actually three mentalities. One of meditative patience, another of trying to nurture something and let it grow and see what happens, and another of exploration and discovery. That's how I'm trying to approach this stuff, and it's at least brought a lot of happiness to myself, and I think produced at least a little bit of good music. Anyway, I'm gonna shut up now, give my throat a rest. Hope to see you again soon in another video. Hope you have a great day, and goodbye for now.